Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Tishner for the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics, and I also coordinate this speaker series, and I'm delighted you could be with us tonight. And now to our main event. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Norman Solomon. He is a renowned journalist, media critic, author, and activist. It is impossible to do justice to his many accomplishments and credits, so I'll name just a few. Many of you may know Solomon from his nationally syndicated weekly column, Media Beat, which ran from 1992 to 2009. Among the dozen books he has written is the critically acclaimed War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death, which was published in 2005. I particularly like the LA Times description, which aptly says that this book is brutally persuasive and a must-read for those who would like greater context with their bitter morning coffee, or to arm themselves for the debates about Iraq that are still to come. A documentary based on War Made Easy was released in 2007. Solomon is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a consortium of policy researchers and analysts. He also is co-founder and coordinator of the online organization rootsaction.org, which now has more than 1.5 million active supporters. So much more to say, but then we would never get to Mr. Solomon's talk. So in a moment, I want you to join me in welcoming Norman Solomon to the University of Oregon. But first, Mr. Solomon would like you to see a clip from a documentary. So with some luck, it'll begin now.
People who at the time were portrayed as loners, as mavericks, as outside of the mainstream of wisdom, turned out to understand the historical moment.
We got to back our president. Since when? Do we have to back our president, or should we, when the president is proposing an unconstitutional act?
The best example is Wayne Morse, the senior senator from Oregon, who, beginning in 1964, was a voice in the congressional wilderness. Senator Morse was unusual in that he challenged the very prerogative of the U.S. government to go to war against Vietnam. He said, it's up to the American people to formulate foreign policy.
Senator, the Constitution gives to the President of the United States the sole responsibility for the conduct of foreign policy.
Couldn't be more wrong. You couldn't make a more unsound legal statement than the one you have just made. This is the promulgation of an old fallacy that foreign policy belongs to the President of the United States.
To whom does it belong then, Senator?
Belongs to the American people,
All right,
and our constitutional fathers made it very clear.
Where does the President fit into this in the responsibility scale?
What I'm saying is, under our Constitution, all the President is the administrator of the people's foreign policy. Those are his prerogatives. And I'm pleading that the American people be given the facts about foreign
Senator,
policy.
That the American people cannot formulate and execute foreign policy?
Why, you're a man of little faith in democracy if you make that kind of announcement. I have complete faith in the ability of the American people to follow the facts if you'll give them.
It isn't
and my charge against
faith,
my
Senator.
government is we're not giving the American people the facts.
And that's the kind of faith in democracy that's not in fashion among the Washington press corps or the power elite in the nation's capital. But it's a good reading of the Constitution, and it's a good definition of democracy.
And now please join me in welcoming Norman Solomon.
Thank you.
Lots happened since 1964 when Wayne Morse went on national television to challenge the conventional wisdom. And today we have the continuation of what could be called the warfare state. It's the wallpaper on the media echo chamber. It's with us so constantly that often we don't give it a second thought. If you go back to the time when Senator Morse appeared facing the great skepticism, not only faced the nation, but faced the skepticism of the media establishment, the political establishment. We remember him as one of only two who voted in the entire Congress against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August of 1964 that opened the floodgates to the Vietnam War. But he was someone more than that who, as he said, when it's wrong, it's just as wrong when we do it as when the Russians do it. Somebody who believed in and advocated for something called international law, which now sounds almost arcane or quaint because we hardly ever hear about it. When we annotate the history of the Vietnam War, there's sort of a clear through line to so many wars since then, so many wars that we forget because it's easy for us to forget. People on the other end of the missiles and bombs, of course, have found it more difficult to set aside in their own lives. So if we look briefly at what happened in 1964, unfortunately, it's kind of a paradigm where Senator Morse raised questions that nobody seemed to want to have answered inside the media political establishment. And the fact that, as it turned out, the U.S. government had been using the South Vietnamese naval forces to shell the North Vietnamese coast before the alleged events in the Gulf of Tonkin that were used as an excuse for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution through Congress, that emerged only many years later in the historical record. As Napoleon said, it's not necessary to censor the news, it's sufficient to delay it until it no longer matters. And we could say, well, it always matters, but it matters most when those facts can be understood in time to prevent the suffering. In 1965, so the year after the non-event called the Gulf of Tonkin attacks on two U.S. vessels, which we now know basically didn't happen, President Johnson said privately in the White House, for all I know, our boys were shooting at whales out there rather than retaliating or trying to retaliate against a U.S. attack. About a third of a century later, when I was writing a column and then later working on the book War Made Easy, I got to thinking, you know, the Washington Post and the New York Times, these great newspapers, published on their front pages as absolute fact what was absolute lie in terms of what happened in the Gulf, that Morse and Senator Greening from Alaska voted against the lies, essentially, when they opposed the resolution a few days later. And I asked Murray Martyr, I said, keep in mind, this was going on into the early part of the 21st century, so 3+ decades later. I said, Mr. Martyr, has the Washington Post ever retracted its coverage of the Gulf of Tonkin? And I'd gone back through the microfilm, and there was by Murray Martyr byline, the lead stories reporting on what had purportedly happened in the Gulf. And he said, oh no, I'm sure the Post never retracted its coverage. And I asked, why not? And he said, well, if the news media of this country were going to retract its coverage of what happened or didn't happen in the Gulf of Tonkin, they'd have to retract virtually their entire coverage of the Vietnam War. So we can move on from there, but put it in a historical context. You know, you go back to the great book by the British journalist Philip Knightley. The title was The First Casualty, of course, pegged on that saying that the first casualty of war is truth. And he documents, going back to the 19th century, how we're not talking just rumor mongers, we're talking the most esteemed media outlets of the day, the 19th and 20th centuries, promulgated as facts deceptions that were hatched by those who were eager to go to war and continue war. And I often think about a short story that I read, written by William Dean Howells, who was a very close friend and editor of Mark Twain's. And in 1905, he wrote a story called Haditha. And in that story, and keep in mind this is in the wake of the Spanish-American War, And a character in the story says, "What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway." So that was already a pattern well set in 1905, and sorry to say, it's very much a pattern that is a paradigm with us in 2018. What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway. The United States of America, most powerful military on the planet and in history, unfathomable technological dominance, a massive communications apparatus with a huge reach globally, but of course most intense inside and most effective inside the United States. News media and entertainment media, with some exceptions, and after all, the essence of propaganda is repetition. That's why you're going to see more than one or two McDonald's commercials in your life, I would guess. The repetition is that drumbeat that hammers in certain messaging time and again, not only a sensibility, a worldview, tinting the world window red, white, and blue for us, but also entertainment as well, what passes for entertainment on TV, what the films are at the multiplexes, and on and on. And umbrelling all that, we're told triumphantly, quite often in the news media, that the United States now the only global superpower. So we're dealing with, whether it's during the Vietnam War or today, when the United States is bombing at least 9 countries that we know of, is engaged in military exercises with most of the governments of Africa, for instance, which we rarely hear anything about. There's the repetition of sort of a myth, and it has, in many ways, its roots in the Vietnam War era that somehow, you've probably heard this one, television brought the Vietnam War into American living rooms. It's one of those ideas that at first glance might make sense, and yet it's hard to think of an idea that's more preposterous. If you look at the great book called Boxed In, The Culture of TV by Mark Crispin Miller, which was published in the late 1980s, he makes the point that really, can you think of anything that's less like being in a war than sitting in your living room, watching footage on TV about a war? I think I'll go to the refrigerator and see what I might have for a snack. Oh, I should go to the bathroom. Maybe I'll make a call. Maybe keep an eye on the TV. In contrast to the terror, the horror, the uncertainty, the chaos of actually being at the other end of the missiles that sometimes, occasionally, the media coverage in our own country through our major media outlets tells us is rendering some representation of as though we experience it. And another corollary of the myth is one that was unpacked and really destroyed by a professor named Daniel Hallen at the University of California, San Diego. He wrote a book called The Uncensored War, uncensored in quotes. And he actually went back and looked at the footage. And if you're as old as I am, you can remember back during the Vietnam War, there were only 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and the nightly half-hour news, and that was it. That was big communication. That was how we got our images. And Professor Hallen found that, contrary to myth, very little of the suffering, very little of the warfare of the Vietnam War ever made it onto American TV. The reality was that we remember those extraordinary moments because they were so unusual, like CBS showing Morley Safer reporting on the Zippo lighters when the Marines burned down a village in Vietnam. And so we're insulated. We have been and we are. It's anesthesia without surgery. It's a psychic numbing, as Robert J. Lifton refers to. It's a kind of a false world that's created for us by news media and politicians to hide from ourselves and encourage us to hide from ourselves that we live in a warfare state where our own country is one that profits by massive destruction, often of people of color far away, people who live in countries that most in the United States couldn't locate on a map. That is what used to be called the product of the military-industrial complex. We might now call it the military-industrial intelligence surveillance complex, particularly after 9/11. Incredibly lucrative. Part of the narrative is that the United States is the victim. We're the ones sinned against more than sinning. And that's been a paradigm when you walk through every single war since the Vietnam War. 1983, the invasion of, Grenada was such a dangerous country for the United States. I think that had 110,000 people who lived in the country. And there were some medical students, of course it was a lie, but we were told we had to go in and invade to rescue them. And then 1989, the former CIA client Manuel Noriega, running the Panamanian government, he had to be overthrown by a U.S. invasion because the spouse of a Navy officer was harassed at a bar. And so it goes, 1991, the first Gulf War. In 1999, what Noam Chomsky called the new military humanism was used to justify the bombings of Kosovo and Yugoslavia. That was, in a way, the perfect war. The perfect U.S. media political war. 79 straight days of U.S.-led NATO bombing of Kosovo and Belgrade. Roads, bridges, hospitals, media outlets being bombed. Not a single American died. Can you imagine a more perfect American war? Of course, one Friday afternoon, as you could read about in The Guardian, a woman went to lunch to get some carrots at the market for her family and ended up shredded by a U.S. cluster bomb. But that got almost no U.S. media coverage whatsoever because the United States was the liberator. And in that particular case, the U.S. diplomats, Madeleine Albright, this is under the Clinton administration in 99, Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke, they had offered a deal called the Rambouillet Accords, which, before the U.S. launched those attacks, offered the Serbian government the option to have the U.S. basically take over their country and not be attacked, but it was portrayed as though it was some sort of halfway measure to try to forestall the necessity of attacking. But if you Google Rambouillet Accords, you'll find that the demand being made by the U.S. was that the United States could control essentially all communications and runways and airports and transport inside the country. No sovereign government would ever allow that. Well, part of the punchline, if you will, that was emphasized by turned out to be the first President Bush after the Gulf War in 1991, and you'll remember perhaps the ticker tape parade of General Schwarzkopf because it was such a triumphant U.S. bombing of Iraq and driving the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. And President Bush said, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, because there was this feeling that, well, Americans were too reticent to engage directly in new military intervention. And a lot of that was a conceit based on the tremendous U.S. technological superiority. And parallel to the fact that, and I'm sure you've found this if you have traveled in Europe, you go to a country like Belgium, say, very few people in Belgium believe that Belgium is the center of the universe or that it's God's gift to the planet. Parallel with that, there's just not that sort of technological military ability to work the will of the government of Belgium on the people of the world. Whereas we have in the United States this ability to use the missiles and all the different technology to crush opponents who are targeted. And this gives rise to a theme which has emerged very powerfully in the era of the cruise missiles and the drones, which is that, as Thomas Merton said long ago, when you kill your enemies from high in the air, then you may not feel it's a moral problem at all. But if there is someone who straps on a suicide belt and drives a bicycle or a car into a cluster of human beings, that is savage, that is inhuman, that is immoral. And so part of that conceit, again, goes back to the Vietnam War. We had people walking the Ho Chi Minh Trail with cut-up tires for shoes. And yet the United States had the most powerful B-52 targeting mechanisms, and they could not be defeated. And this was infuriating. And so what's been called full spectrum dominance is a mission that has been accomplished, actualized more and more in the decades since then to now. Whereas it's a non-issue. Can you imagine what Senator Morse would say now? The absolute abrogation of international law. When the US government wants to send cruise missiles or drones across borders, the American people may not even know. And there's very little US media coverage or queries about what's involved. In his introduction to Brave New World, Aldous Huxley said that lies are powerful, but even more powerful is silence about truth. It's what isn't said. It's about people who don't exist on the US media radar screen. They literally don't have a face that we ever see. They don't have a name. They don't have an identity. And the shattering of their silence, the silence about them, is always an imperative for people who want to change US foreign policy and challenge what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. When people don't have an identity, a name, a face, if they cannot be understood to be human beings, then it's easy to passively accept their extermination in our names and with our tax dollars. On March 22nd, 1991, then the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, was interviewed at the Pentagon, and he was asked about the Iraqi deaths from the six-week war that had just been concluded, what we know as the first Gulf War. In those 6 weeks, the reporter asked General Powell how many Iraqi civilians had died as a result of the U.S. bombing. And General Powell said, quote, "It's really not a number I'm terribly interested in," unquote. As it happened, the Associated Press reported on the same day that according to its sources at the Pentagon, the U.S. bombing during that 6-week period had killed 100,000 Iraqi people. How does this happen? Well, of course, there are a lot of reasons. The relationship between the U.S. news media and the military planners and those who are top-level war makers, that has been a very tight relationship. It still is very tight. What the Washington Post reporter Murray Martyr told me is that he was sort of curious about some of the story that he was reporting that didn't seem to check out. But as he said, within a couple days after his front page story ran, the Washington Post had editorially endorsed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and then it was passed, of course, almost unanimously by Congress. He said the horse was already out of the barn. It was too late. It's very interesting that we're told journalism is the first draft of history. It's usually such a false draft, and then later on, you're playing catch-up. I may have, writing in the Progressive magazine, written virtually the only negative review of Katharine Graham's book,
personal history when it came out, which then went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. And who can be down on somebody so wonderfully portrayed by Meryl Streep in a film, right, in the Post? And there are just huge gaping holes in the narrative, not only the film, but the acclaimed book. It's almost, even at the time, considered to be churlish to point out that Graham's Post newspaper was gung-ho for the Vietnam War. When she soured on it, like Walter Cronkite in 1968, the souring was because the war wasn't being won and there was a fear it could not be won. And this was a tremendous difference between the media establishment and the anti-war movement. A tremendous difference between what people like Walter Cronkite or Katharine Graham eventually were brought to advocate, and that is the end of a war because it couldn't be won, and the moral reality that it should never have been fought in the first place. As Daniel Ellsberg, who provided the world in 1971 with the Pentagon Papers, said, he came to realize that the United States wasn't on the wrong side in the Vietnam War. The United States was the wrong side. And one of the great myths is that somehow the news media will tell us when a war is wrong, maybe a little bit tardy. The Boston Globe did a study in February of 1968 of a few dozen of the largest daily newspapers in the United States. And it could not find a single daily newspaper in the United States that advocated for withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. And keep in mind, this was a time when already large numbers of Americans had been protesting the Vietnam War. This was a time when, for instance, almost a year had passed since upwards of 150,000 people on one day had marched down Madison Avenue to the United Nations to protest the war where Dr. King spoke. In denouncing it, and in turn, he was being denounced by the Washington Post editorials, the New York Times editorials, Time Magazine editorials, as someone who was betraying his people by opposing the war. I don't think Dr. King knew the word intersectionality in 1967, but that's what he was articulating, that these forms of oppression, the racism, the hostility to the poor, the greed, the environmental destruction, the militarism, the arrogance, the belief in imperial power over third world people that propelled the Vietnam War, that propelled U.S. foreign policy and continues to do so in this century through the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama and now Donald Trump. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Overarching, I believe, is it's incredibly profitable. A lot of rich people are getting richer and richer from the slaughter. And what is the purpose of this extreme militarism of the United States? Who benefits? Well, I can certainly mention who doesn't benefit. It's people in Eugene who don't have a home. It's people who don't have adequate nutrition. It's children and the elderly who lack basic health care. We could have a long list of people who don't benefit from this misappropriation of priorities, but who does? Well, I'm going to quote one of the great acclaimed members of the U.S. punditocracy, Thomas Friedman, in his acclaimed book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Quote, "The hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the U.S. Air Force F-15, and the hidden hand that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies to flourish is called the U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps." It sort of reminds me of the U.S. media in general. Now there's, especially after the Occupy movement and the tremendous inroads of the Bernie Sanders campaign, 2015-16,
There's increasing acknowledgement that there is something called the working class in this country. Much more reticence from the mass media to talk about how the warfare state and the establishment powers of this country, media, political, legalistic powers, and so forth, that there is an elite superstructure that, whether you call it a ruling class or anything else, really doesn't matter. But there is an elite power that is contrary to democracy. And it's quite ironic, perhaps, to put it mildly. Here we live in a country where, in the state of Georgia, more than 50,000 people have had their rights to vote just sequestered and it looks like quite possibly set aside, where voter suppression is routine state government policy in one state after another, where the barriers to the exercise of the franchise have been maintained to the detriment of the most basic concepts of democracy, where people like the Koch brothers have been able to exert tremendous transitions in power by dint of expenditures over not just the last few years, but the last couple of decades, tremendous amounts of money. How often have we heard about the threat of American oligarchs to democracy? I don't see it very much. You know, if you search in U.S. news media, the term American oligarchs, not very often. But I seem to dimly remember hearing about Russian oligarchs. And they're the ones that are really the threats to our democracy. It's not the huge money and the huge monetary thumbs on the scales of our political process from our own military-industrial complex, our own oligarchs. It's those foreigners. They're the ones that are doing it, which is part of the militarism of our era. It fits in very nicely and neatly. It's worn sort of thin to increase the U.S. military budget, and by the way, it's not a lowercase d defense budget. Military budget, how do you justify that to stop people with box cutters? That wore sort of thin, but when you have a foreign enemy, China and now Russia especially being emphasized, you're able to gin up this frenzy so that Congress this year passed an 11% increase in military spending, above an already hugely bloated military budget. The aerospace industry at the trough, all sorts of contractors making a killing, literally and figuratively, from the military-industrial complex. Very little scrutiny from the U.S. You know, if in terms of media, in terms of really looking at what that's about, what are the consequences, what's the validity of the ostensible reasons. And if Wayne Morse were with us today, challenging militarism, he would find it just as much an uphill climb in his own party in 2018 as he did in 1964, 5, 6, 7, and 8. When the Trump administration was able to get this huge military increase through the Congress, Chuck Schumer, the leading Democrat in the Senate, put out a news release. Wanted to know that as the leader of the Democrats, he was a full supporter of this increase of what he called the defense budget. The minority leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi, she also put out a news release. We want the American people to know that Democrats stand firmly behind this increase in military spending. Well, part of the way that this kind of military spending, and of course then it's parallel to the wars, the wars justify the spending, and vice versa, is to just blot out certain parts of history. And I'll give you an example. I went to Baghdad in September of 2002, and December 2002, and January of 2003, different delegations to try to find alternatives to a U.S. invasion. And as you may remember, the UN inspectors had left Iraq, and it was important to bring them back. And so we went with Congressman Ray Hall and former Senator Jim Abourezk in September, and then the U.S. Congress voted for war in October of 2002, and our efforts through the Institute for Public Accuracy to get other members of Congress to go to Baghdad on similar missions ran into roadblocks because after the Congress voted, including with many Democrats, unfortunately, for war in mid-October, members of Congress who had been interested in following up on the initial trip, which was seen as successful, and simultaneously, very soon after, the UN inspectors were invited back in. Cold feet, U.S. news media, not interested, case closed, Congress had decided, time to go to war. So we began to knock on other doors, and Sean Penn was willing to go, and we went to Baghdad, again met with Tariq Aziz, and then January 2003, Dennis Halliday, former UN head of the Oil for Food program in Iraq, a high official at the United Nations, I accompanied him to yet a third visit to Baghdad, yet a third meeting with the number 2 person in the government, Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister. And I remember that Dennis Halliday brought with him a copy of the latest issue of Time magazine, and there on the cover was Donald Rumsfeld, who was at that point, of course, the uppercase D defense secretary. And Aziz glanced at the cover of that Time magazine, and I wrote down what he said. He said, Rumsfeld has become quite a warmonger. He did not seem so when he came and visited us in the 1980s, unquote. And what Aziz was referring to, and we have footage of that meeting, handshake between Rumsfeld representing the Reagan administration and Saddam Hussein in our film War Made Easy. But Tariq Aziz was referring to the fact that Rumsfeld had come to Baghdad in a very friendly way at a time when we later were told what a bad person Saddam Hussein was. You know, we've lived at a time in the last many decades, we've had a lot of Hitlers running around, according to U.S. news media. You had Ho Chi Minh, you had Manuel Noriega, you had Saddam Hussein, you had Milosevic. There was a lot of people lined up to be Hitlers, according to U.S. media coverage. But in this case, it was very retroactive, because as in the case of Manuel Noriega and others, first off, the U.S. is playing ball with a foreign leader, but then if there's some sort of falling out, all of a sudden the evils that are done must be condemned rather than actually supported, which was the case when Iraq was at war with Iran and initiated that war. And so that's what Aziz was saying, was basically, you loved us until you decided we had a falling out. Now you're getting ready to invade us, which of course is what happened. And we tend to focus on invasions. They're never really totally hidden. We know that they take place. We know certain wars the United States has had ground troops involved with. But I should mention other aspects of U.S. involvement in warfare, and that is supporting insurgents or supporting governments engaged in counterinsurgency to a highly deadly degree. For instance, in 1965, the U.S. government supplied lists of alleged communists to the leader in Indonesia, and about 500,000 of them were slaughtered, just in a very short period of time. And if you go back and look at the microfilm, the New York Times celebrated this at the time. It only came out later that the U.S. had supplied the names, but the actual killing of those alleged communists, which often just activists, labor leaders and so forth, that was applauded as something really good. Okay, that was the 1960s. Then the 1970s, the United States government, first under the Nixon-Ford administrations and then perpetuated under Jimmy Carter, there began the slaughter of people in East Timor by the Indonesian government. And easily 1/3 of, I think it's 700,000 people living in East Timor were just butchered with the help of U.S. military aid. As a matter of fact, Jimmy Carter, when he came into office, got a request to renew the military aid, which he approved. We read very little about this in our news media. In the 1980s, it was a bit more controversial. There was more visibility. U.S. aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, and I'm sure many people in the room here were involved in some way in trying to end the U.S. military aid, overt and covert, to the Contras trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. Now we're told that there's a problem with certain tyrants in the world, but until a couple of weeks ago, there was very little media coverage of Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most tyrannical regimes on the planet. And often we're told, well, you know, you have to be active. You can't just be passive, as though the alternative is to be totally isolationist and passive, or to be a warfare state constantly engaged in intervention with the news media avidly trying to justify the intervention. The fact is that there are other alternatives is rarely put forward. And for one thing, if we're against torture, and we're against regimes that torture, and occasionally we're told we must go to war to overthrow regimes that torture, the most obvious first step is to start a foreign policy that refuses to support regimes that torture. It's just so basic, it's hidden in plain sight, but that would mean the United States, for instance, would break off its aid and its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But even now, that's just frankly not on the table at all. It's not on the table at all. It doesn't justify and sustain the profits from the arms sales and so forth. I want to say a little bit about Russia, a little bit more about Russia, because so many people who have reason to and have felt reasons to oppose U.S. military intervention have become convinced that Russia is a mortal enemy of U.S. democracy and really a threat to peace in the world. And I want to ask you to consider how often you've heard, seen, or read in U.S. news media reference to some basic facts. You know, I referred to the way in which U.S. news media tint our window on the world red, white, and blue. And that has very serious consequences. It's sort of common sense that we're encouraged to not bother to consider that if, as the lawyers say, we're going to stipulate that the entire world doesn't center around the United States, that other people have other outlooks and they have other perspectives. And so in this case, we rarely hear from the U.S. news media the fact that when the Berlin Wall was falling and when there was an imminent proposal to reunify Germany, the United States government, through the first President Bush administration, promised Russia that if Germany were reunited, NATO would not move, quote, 1 inch eastward, unquote. And since that time, NATO has moved up to Russia's borders. Large numbers of countries have been incorporated into NATO, and you get to ask yourself, you remember the old Warsaw Pact, which was sort of the counter bloc, military bloc to NATO. Can you imagine when the Warsaw Pact was in existence, what if it had expanded to Mexico or Canada? What would have been the reaction in official circles in Washington? People would have considered it to be tantamount to a declaration of war. But somehow this basic fact about NATO's encirclement of Russia is very rarely alluded to at all in the U.S. news media, which helps to stoke the, in many ways, unprecedented magnitude of war games that NATO has been engaged in. When I was in Germany a couple of years ago, around the working on a story around the one of the military bases in that country in southwest Germany, they were getting record numbers of ammunition shipments in to U.S. Army depots for NATO. This whole stoking up, which is a back and forth escalation. So why don't we get this information about U.S. refusal to abide by this agreement on expanding NATO? How often have we heard about the role of the United States government in imposing what was called Shock Therapy on the Economy of the Post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s, where setting a global record for peacetime, life expectancy plunged through the fire sale, sell-offs of public property, and the establishment of relationships between U.S. corporations and oligarchs in Russia. And then you may have heard something about there's some concern about meddling in elections involving the United States and Russia. I'm still looking for a major U.S. media outlet to mention that in 1996, Americans had a huge role in seeing to it that Boris Yeltsin was reelected. And if you look at a cover of Time magazine in 1996, there's a full cover picture of Boris Yeltsin, and the big headline is "Yanks to the Rescue," and it celebrates how Americans came in and they didn't meddle, they just basically flipped the election over on behalf of Boris Yeltsin. Abrogation of the ABM Treaty by President George W. Bush in 2002, and then the placement of very dangerous ABM systems, anti-ballistic missile systems, on the periphery of Russia. And then here's one. I want to ask you how many times you've read this in U.S. news media, seen it, heard it. The United States has 800 military bases outside the borders of the USA. 800. How many military bases does Russia have outside the borders of Russia? The number is 9. So you would perhaps want to, first you need the information, right? And then we would want to ask ourselves, well, the United States had 800 military bases overseas, and Russia has 9, most of them in their own former republics of the Soviet Union, and they're the ones that are threatening the peace of the world, not us. And then you think of the regime change that we've been engaged in, the United States has been engaged in, time after time after time, asserting that prerogative for regime change, and we're the ones sinned against. We don't sin, we're sinned against, which is a worldview. It was a worldview when Wayne Morse spoke during the 1960s, and it's a worldview today. And if you, in Orwellian fashion, set aside all concepts of international law, if you embrace double standards, but don't call them double standards, just call them common sense. As Antonio Gramsci said, when we internalize common sense, quote unquote, to be equivalent to what those in power tell us is common sense, we're in deep trouble. I referred earlier to not only news media, but entertainment media. And I'd like to mention a couple of films. One of the highest grossing films, I think, in history was American Sniper, directed by Clint Eastwood. And there's sort of a paradigm in there where partway through the film, this veteran or the soldier who's back on leave, back home, and excels as a very precise sniper, for some unaccountable reason, his wife has lost some enthusiasm for the U.S. war in Iraq. And she starts to say partway through the film, I really have doubts whether this war is moral. I have doubts whether this war should be pursued. Why should you and other troops be in Iraq fighting there? It doesn't seem right. But the narrative of the film continues, and before it's over, the sniper's spouse comes to realize and articulate that it's a good war, that it's a correct war, that it's a moral war, and it's a patriotic war. And it made me remember, back in the mid-1960s, a film called The Green Berets, starring John Wayne. And in that film, the naysayer wasn't a spouse, it was a newspaper reporter, and he had sort of shaggy hair, which back then was a tip-off that he had an attitude problem. And so he expresses his doubts, and John Wayne, as a Green Beret hero, sort of tolerates the reporter, but eventually the reporter comes to see and express that actually the U.S. war in Vietnam is a noble undertaking. That sort of messaging, it's not 100%. There are cracks in the media walls of militarism, but it's a recurring theme. And as I say, the exceptions are exceptional, but the essence of propaganda is the repetition, what is drumbeated at us. And that's the media political environment that we live in. I know this is not too cheery a presentation this evening, but at the same time, when we can discern and analyze it, that's a crucial step. Once we do that, that's how movements are built and sustained. That's how policies are changed. That's how good journalism can be supported and encouraged and expand. It's been the power of social movements that has restrained the militarism of the United States to the point that it would be worse if it weren't for those movements. So that might seem like a sort of a thin comfort, not a small amount of comfort, but it's crucial. Because when people galvanize and utilize what democratic, lowercase d, democratic possibilities exist, history has changed. And we would have had a much more dire situation in the last several decades if it wasn't for education and agitation and organizing and participating in the democratic process, both electoral and non-electoral. As Jim Hightower says, in a washing machine, it's the agitator that gets the dirt out. And that's true in terms of social change as well. I think about how history, again, gets rewritten, and it's so important that we not allow history to be taken from us. That's one of the first steps of an Orwellian process. First in real time, journalism as the purported first draft of history, and then in retrospect. And so I'd like to close by asking this question: what are some of the enduring messages from Martin Luther King Jr. that we rarely hear in the U.S. mass media? We all, at times of the King holiday, are apt to hear or see on television his wonderful "I Have a Dream" speech in August of 1963. But if you only knew history from U.S. media, you might think that he didn't do much after that, and that he sort of rode off into the sunset until he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. But we know that isn't the case. We know that he began to link issues of foreign policy and domestic policy. As he said, the barefoot people of the world are rising up, and that there's a need to support their revolution. We need a revolution in values, he said, having to do with poverty and wealth, to set aside the militarism and find different ways to exist in the world as the United States of America, drastically different ways. And if you read or hear the speech that he gave exactly 1 year before he was killed at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, you can hear this tremendous clarion call for a moral foreign policy that is directly tied in with moral domestic policy, to set aside the jingoism, the bellicose foreign policy, and to see a way in which what he called the madness of militarism could be set aside for something that offers true national security. When he, and I'm quoting here, called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, you can imagine it was not a palatable message. He was denounced by news media. He was denounced by many politicians. But his words then are not at all dated. They're still with us today. They're just as powerful and relevant today. When he said,
I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism. It's a crucial approach in 2018, just as it was in 1967. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So our first questioner tonight is Courtney Kimona. Before law school, Courtney served as an officer in the Marine Corps specializing in public affairs. And this past summer, she worked in D.C. as a law fellow for Representative Earl Blumenauer. So without further ado, Courtney, why don't you jump in with the first question?
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for joining us tonight. So you explained the issues, some of the issues that exist with our conglomerate media. And while I was listening, it made me wonder, where do we turn to get accurate information? Because right now it seems like we have limited options. And my question is, isn't some information that we can think critically about better than no information at all?
Well, I think being in a position to think critically about all media are very important, and I would never recommend any media outlet as the gospel. I think we should always be considering crucial issues like, who are the sources? Sources and sourcing are absolutely crucial, and journalists who have a narrow range of sources are going to give a narrow perspective on the world. So I would recommend, many people here, I'm sure, have favorite websites and you go to and you're able to augment mainline media. But just as a general suggestion or one example of what one might do, I would say that if you were to read the New York Times every day and you were to listen to All Things Considered or Morning Edition, and you were to watch or listen to Democracy Now!, and you were to read commondreams.org and truthout.org, you would have an array of perspectives and information. And then I would think you would have a broad window in the world. And I think that could be very helpful. What's very concerning, I think, is, and I've met many people who say, well, I read the New York Times and the New Yorker, I understand what's going on in the world. I find that a frightening perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Solomon, I found it very strange that you left some crucial details in your presentation. Chief among them was the exclusion of Israel and the role it plays in all these wars in the Middle East, and how most of the folks in this room and elsewhere in the country really see the views of the Middle East through either the Zionist pundits or through the Zionist lobby. You did not, for instance, mention Sheldon Adelson, with all that tremendous money that he provides not only for newspapers or other organizations, as well as the corruption that American politicians have. Even Wayne Morse, I recall at the time I was a student in California, was peculiarly absent. His voice is strong, the so-called tiger of the Senate, was absent when it came to the war, 67 war, and for instance, the attack of the Israelis on USS Liberty, and how Israelis killed all these people, American servicemen, 37 on USS Liberty, 107 severely injured. Nothing happened. You mentioned about the condemnation of the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, but how about to Israel? What is the role of Israel in the tremendous massacre of Muslims in the Middle East? And why should we accept Israel? Who said that if the Palestinians do not accept Israel, then why should we?
Yeah. Well, one of the facts that has been missing from the coverage of Saudi Arabia in the last couple of weeks is that Saudi Arabia, rhetoric aside, is very closely allied with Israel geopolitically. They're targeting Iran together. They're part of a de facto alliance, which, together with Egypt, is supporting
basic suppression of human rights. In terms of my own work, if you look at the War Made Easy book, you'll find material about Israel. If you look at my book, The Habits of Highly Deceptive Media, you'll find reference to Israel. And if you just Google my name in Israel, you will find it as well. Basically, the United States is supporting many governments around the world that suppress human rights, and certainly Israel is in that category. If you look at the alliances in the Middle East, the United States has aligned itself with Arab dictators and the Israeli government to suppress human rights. That has just been fundamental. And one of the underplayed and undercovered realities in U.S. media about the Israeli government is that it has been closely aligned with racist regimes around the world. Israel was very closely aligned with the apartheid South African government, with Rios Mott and others in Central America, engaged in, for instance, genocide against Mayan people in Guatemala. So this is a long history, and certainly I agree that the media coverage has been in this country, with some exceptions, abysmal on the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon, for your work on the structural deficiencies in U.S. media, which have been very helpful, especially the weekly program on the radio from the Media Watch Group Fair. Excellent, brilliant. So
I think you're referring to the program Counterspin, which is airing on about 150 radio stations weekly from Fair, yes.
Bingo, thank you. So anyway, I would like to supply a piece of content, which I think would be useful. As a veteran, I'm really pained by the fact that none of the wars since at least World War II have been self-defense. So we've invaded country after country, killing millions of people in the Korean War, which you didn't mention is just as bad as the Vietnam War. And so I'd like to suggest that the military did not serve, they actually disserved. And so one of the main pieces of propaganda or doctrine that is repeated constantly all over this campus and all over Eugene is, here's a memorial to those who served, and these are the service members, and service this and service that. Disservice is the word. Please join me in dissing the U.S. military, because they know what they're doing. Thank you.
Well, I do want to mention, one of my jobs is as director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. We offer sources to news media. We've been doing this for 20 years. And I found, in terms of speaking and meeting with people and offering people with expertise for interviews, that the organization Veterans for Peace is a terrific group. And when you meet with people who've been in wars and who have gone through a tremendous self-questioning about what's called sometimes moral injury and soul-searching, often they're able to articulate in ways that those of us who haven't been in combat really aren't able to do so. And one of the aspects of news media in the country is, with rare exceptions, they're not heard. They don't have a platform. They don't have a megaphone.
Hi, I think it's very important to focus on pretexts for war, like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But I think one of the aspects of that that gets very little attention is the year before, Senator Morse was told by the President Kennedy, on November 12th, at a meeting at the White House, that he had signed National Security Action Memo 263, which has been declassified about 30 years ago, calling for starting the withdrawal from Vietnam. If that had happened, there would have been no Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the history of America and many other places would have been very different. I know historians don't like what's called counterfactual narratives, but I recommend Robert Kennedy Jr.'s latest book, which talks about this in detail, called American Values, where he points out that the Central Intelligence Agency staged a military coup in America, flipping our foreign policy, our domestic policy. And I think part of the way out, you mentioned Martin Luther King in April 4, 1967. Well, many years later, the King family came to understand that the actual perpetrator of the assassination of Martin Luther King was the Memphis Police Department in conjunction with the FBI and the CIA. And they called, well, the question is, they called for a South Africa-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission for looking at the crimes of the United States Empire. And there's not been much attention to that in our country, but I think it's way overdue because we're obviously not going to prosecute these people. We've tried that. It doesn't really work. How can we have truth and reconciliation for crimes of empire so we have a more peaceful world?
Well, I think we just need more diverse media to start, and that would really be helpful. I'm going to take basically what you said as a statement, not a question, but I do think that there needs to be a much wider array of journalists in positions of reaching the public who will raise difficult questions. Yes?
Hey, Colin Farnsworth. I was hoping you could speak on the Congress's responsibility for their declaration of war. It's their war powers that, supposedly are starting these wars, and they haven't been declaring a war since World War II. And then the Federal Reserve just, giving them, just printing money for these wars to continue. And if that didn't happen, then, I think if our taxes all were to raise due to these ongoing wars, we might be a little bit more outraged than if our taxes are, we have to pay for it 50 years down the line. So those are my questions.
Well, as we saw in the film clip, and as Senator Morse was at pains to try to point out, I think it's, Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution, this is a congressional responsibility having to do with war. And both Democrats and Republicans in Congress have bridled at that, have refused to go along with it, have pushed more and more all of that power into the Oval Office. And it's very dangerous.
And the Federal Reserve?
I'm not going to get into the Federal Reserve, but thank you. Yeah.
Hello. Yesterday was United Nations Day, and as you know, October 24th, okay, was United Nations Day. And I'm wondering, you didn't talk about it, but how can we implement changes in the United Nations so that it's more effective, a voice and an actor in world peace?
You may remember that John Bolton, in his previous job with the Bush administration, made a comment that it wouldn't be a problem if some of the top floors of the UN building disappeared, right? Didn't he say that? Am I remembering correctly? And, that is a more overt expression of the attitude towards the United Nations from the upper reaches of the executive branch of the U.S. government. Thomas Friedman, who I quoted earlier, was one of the more candid pundits during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq when he wrote a column, and I have this in War Made Easy, as I remember. He said, well, we need to invade Iraq, but we need the United Nations to legitimize it before we do it. And that's basically an attitude that, to a large degree, I think presidents of both parties have had it for a long time in this country. And it's what J. William Fulbright called the arrogance of power. And yet the United Nations, as many people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, said at the outset, is really crucial. We're on one planet. I haven't mentioned climate, but of course, whether it's climate or war, the two existential threats to humanity on the planet are climate and nuclear war. And our news media, how often do you hear about the phrase nuclear winter? I mean, these are not really separate issues. Climate change is really not that slow, but it's over a period now still of years and decades to come to its final awful impacts. But thermonuclear war between Russia and the United States scientifically is pretty certain to, if it happens, bring about nuclear winter in a matter of months. It's like you would have a couple of centuries of climate change compressed into a matter of a few weeks when agriculture on the planet would end. How long does humanity persist? And yet, the Obama and Trump administrations have moved ahead with $1 trillion with a T, $1 trillion modernization, euphemism for extermination of humanity technology, $1 trillion upgrading of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. This is, even to call it an issue isn't the right word. How often do we hear about it in the news media? Not at all. Again, the United Nations is a crucial forum for raising these issues and moving ahead on hopefully binding agreements. Thank you.
You kind of touched on this in two questions prior, but in recent times, the AUMF has come under a lot of scrutiny for allowing the president to wage war wherever he or she sees fit.
Yeah.
In what ways do you think the AUMF really does allow the president to do that? And what ways do you think the president would just do that regardless of the AUMF's existence?
Yeah. The authorization for use of military force was approved by Congress just a few days after 9/11 with only one dissenting vote, Barbara Lee, Congresswoman from California. And since then, it's been stretched and stretched and stretched to interpret basically anybody who the president wants to kill. You know, that somehow that's connected to the forces that perpetrated the crime of 9/11. And it's a further giant incremental step towards saying that it's a blank check, you know, written in blood. Go ahead and do it. The president proceed with war however he wishes to, has been history up to this moment. And it goes to, again to this question of a warfare state. What does a democracy mean if this is the status quo? You know, we're put in a position of being passive. You know, it's like we're on a very big vehicle, and there's somebody at the wheel driving, and we're just supposed to fasten our seatbelts and hope for the best, even if we're headed to a cliff, whether it's climate or nuclear annihilation. That's the opposite of activism. You know, it's the opposite of changing history, and a lot of times people will understandably say, this is so depressing, I think I'll just go do something else. But I find, and many people I know find, that rather than tune in to the unfolding apocalypse in a passive way, it's much more energizing and it's much less depressing to actually do something about it. Organize, raise hell, fight back, bring your humanity to the fore.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask a question contrary to some of the previous people. What do you think is the responsibility of the president with his rhetoric about the fake news? And I believe that he even mentioned in, he was on tape or filmed in Michael Moore's recent film where he's hinting that, maybe you should kill a journalist, or maybe not, I don't know. What do you think the responsibility of our current president is regarding to the assassination of Khashoggi?
Indirectly, there's certainly an atmosphere that Donald Trump has created that's been conducive to sort of plowed the ground for people to then take the next step. And I can't remember any time since the 1960s when the mass media have been as critical of a president as President Trump. I mean, let's face it, the New York Times, the Washington Post, much of the media establishment is in direct conflict with Trump because he's so extreme, he's so unwilling to acknowledge basic facts, he lies so constantly, and certainly his proclivity towards violence is very dangerous and propagates it, encourages it. That said, when Lyndon Johnson got on TV and denounced the riots in Detroit and Los Angeles because violence never solves anything, while he's ordering massive military attacks on North Vietnam with B-52s and incinerating children, that was sort of hard to take. When, at the time of the Columbine massacre, President Clinton denounced violence and that young people must learn that violence is never a way to solve problems, while people in Serbia and Kosovo are being killed as he speaks with US-led NATO bombing runs, it's a little thick, you know? And so it's asking people to do this whole double-think process all the time. And that's very corrosive.
My concern was that the prince who's now taking power in Saudi Arabia might have gotten a clear message from Trump that the United States was not going to react to an assassination.
Well, yes, it's very overt, and let's face it. before him in the White House, Obama and Trump were also palsy-walsy with Saudi Arabia, partly because that's the linchpin of the oil relationship in the Middle East. That's part of the alliances that include Saudi Arabia and Israel, who are both very powerful military forces. When there was a human rights uprising in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia came in to crush it, Obama was, no problem because the US Navy fleet is there. There were doctors going out into the streets and nurses going into the streets to help people who are wounded by the Bahrainian troops, and then they were being killed, journalists being imprisoned. So a single stand, there's all of this ideology and nationalism and propaganda flying around the United States and the world. And how do you not get lost? I think one of the ways you don't get lost, you can find your way if you have a single standard of human rights. If you've got a single standard of human rights, then the bluster and nonsense coming from all directions is easier to set aside. And that's, I think, if we had news media, let alone politicians, that did have a single standard of human rights, there wouldn't be so much confusion. And I would say that you can listen to All Things Considered, and you can listen every day, and it's just a confusing world because they're detouring around corporate power. They're not explaining hardly anything about how things really work. It's just sort of a fantasy world that's made up in many respects in terms of power. I mean, I'm not going to quote Thomas Jefferson or Karl Marx. I'm going to quote Humpty Dumpty. Remember in Through the Looking Glass when Alice says, the question is, how can you make one word mean so many different things? And Mr. Dumpty replied, the question is, who's to be master? That's all. And so much of this flows from money and power, whether it's the Register Guard or the New York Times. You can read daily newspapers around this country and never find out who owns the city. What are the real estate interests that are manipulating our own communities? And that's no accident because the huge advertisers and the owners are corporate and wealthy individuals and companies, and they have a different interest than working people do. And I would argue that, as Eugene Debs did during World War I and went to prison for his pains, the interests of working people are absolutely contrary to war. Or I wish I could sing it, but that song, what is war good for? It's good for absolutely nothing, except making some rich people richer.
Curious to hear what you have to say about the phrase fake news.
I'm really leery of the phrase fake news because it's come to mean almost anything. And I mean, the Gulf of Tonkin coverage was fake news. The front page of the New York Times and Washington Post about weapons of mass destruction, people like Judy Miller and Michael Gordon at the Times reporting about the WMDs. That was fake news. So, it's sort of like, what are we talking about? I think it's a rhetorical blunderbuss at this point, and people can mean all sorts of different things with it. I guess it can mean something, but it can mean so many different things.
Hi, so I was wondering with the death, like recent and very public death of Jamal Khashoggi, I was wondering if being such a controversial and public occurrence, do you think that U.S. and Saudi Arabian relationship will change and possibly withdraw some of the support that the U.S. has on the Yemen war?
I think it will change, but how much is really an open question. I'm not terribly optimistic. There's so much oil money on the table. There's so much military sales money on the table, into the billions and billions of dollars of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And when push comes to shove, it's very difficult to leave the money on the table when the value system treasures the money and the profits over everything else. And the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was horrible. And at the same time, it should be said that the worst cholera epidemic in history has been going on because of, in Yemen, the Saudi bombing of that country. And there's been vast massacres of many people. And we should ask ourselves, in terms of U.S. news media, how is it that the murder from the air of thousands and thousands of people in Yemen over the last couple of years has gotten a tiny fraction of the amount of outrage compared to the killing of this one journalist? And I suspect if this journalist had been working for an independent outlet rather than the Washington Post, there'd be much less outrage from the mass media.
So, last question.
I appreciate your appreciation of Wayne Morse, but my question is, it seems to me we've walked away a long time ago from the moral meaning, the argument over the moral meaning of the Vietnam War. And in a sense, that perpetuates all these other wars that followed. And I was wondering if you agree with that. Have we resolved the moral meaning? Have we come to some common understanding of what the Vietnam War means morally? And if not, you know, what is that? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, what is that, the first person plural? Is that what you call we? Do I have that right? That's a very tricky word. We. I don't.
American citizens.
Well, there's a lot of American citizens. I mean.
And we had an argument over Vietnam, and we've walked away from that argument.
Well, I think that some Americans have reached very different conclusions than other Americans, but if I can take your question and interpret it as U.S. mass media, would that work?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think U.S. mass media have decided to put the Vietnam War largely down the Orwellian vacuum tube. For instance, most of us here, I would imagine, have gone to the wall in Washington and the 55,000 names of people who died in the war itself, and a greater number have died from suicide later. But that number of 55,000 on the wall, if you were to build a wall and put the names of the 2 to 3 million Vietnamese people, let alone the people in the Plain of Jars in Laos, for instance, killed by the U.S., how long would that wall be? And the inherent bias, the nationalism, the racism, the refusal to acknowledge what U.S. wars have done, it's so deep and so wide that anybody who would propose that would be considered beyond the pale of reasonable discussion and perhaps a lunatic, out of touch with the media and politics of the country. So I think that what the Vietnam War was, what the Vietnamese people call the American War, it's filtered through that window on the world that's red, white, and blue. And it's narcissistic, it's a national narcissism. It's inherently elevating the value of American lives well over the lives of anybody else. And was it Faulkner who said, the past isn't even past? Right? It's not over. The arguments over that war are also arguments about the next war. And that's one of the reasons history is so important.
So please join me in thanking Norman.
Thank you. Thank you very much.